You're listening to the Labor Notes podcast. I'm Natasha Eleni Ullman, staff writer at Labor Notes.
And I'm Danielle Smith, an organizer at Labor Notes. If you've read our website lately or already have the November issue of our magazine in hand, you'll notice a new series we've started running these past few weeks called the Labor Notes Roundtable.
You can also read the pieces at The American Prospect, which co-published the pieces with us. But basically, we've invited organizers and labor scholars to contribute articles that would address some of the most pressing attacks on working people right now that are coming from the second Trump administration and its billionaire supporters.
And we should note, especially this week, that workers who have been fighting back all year long, rallying in the streets in pro-democracy demonstrations, organizing to bring in new members, strategizing to build power in their locals for further disruption in May 2028, have been making serious headway. On Tuesday, voters in New York City elected Zohran Mamdani to be its next mayor after a historic campaign that centered the demands and stories of working-class New Yorkers and brought in 100,000 volunteers who knocked on doors to engage working-class voters on a platform relentlessly focused on the city's affordability crisis. And we are recording this the day after Election Day, so if my voice sounds a little bit hoarse, that's why.
The whole campaign was a model for exercising working-class politics to build political power. The contributors to our Roundtable series have more ideas on how to do that, and on Tuesday, November 18th, we'll be having some of them on for a webinar that we're co-hosting with Haymarket Books and co-moderating with the American Prospect. You can sign up at labornotes.org/events. We have a special guest on Labor Notes Pod today, one of the contributors to our Roundtable series, to talk about his case for what this next year could look like for working people, trying to build momentum towards mass mobilization and disrupting business as usual. It'll take creative ideas, strategic thinking, and courage, as he writes in the piece, and it won't be easy, so let's quickly take stock of what we're up against. Not all of the attacks we're seeing this year may be totally unfamiliar to workers, but many are new, especially in scale and brutality. In addition to violent ICE raids, in which masked agents in plain clothes are snatching and detaining immigrants and citizens off the streets and at courthouses, the Trump administration has also dispatched or attempted to send troops into a number of cities led by Democratic mayors, parroting a baseless refrain about supposed lawlessness. And here, they're really talking about democratic protests protected by the First Amendment to justify violating civil rights en masse, to brutalize civilians, and repress dissent.
The administration has also made several sledgehammer moves to reshape government, not to mention its relationship to federal workers as the country's largest employer. And under Trump, the executive branch is also undermining Congress by refusing to spend its allocated budget for certain agencies. This is currently at the heart of why the government has been shut down for more than a month now. And back in March, Trump signed an executive order seeking to end collective bargaining for about 1 million federal workers, as our coworker Jenny Brown has reported. This is on top of the job insecurity, surveillance, and layoffs this administration has subjected those workers to.
So we know all this. We rallied about all this at May Day, at No Kings, and at other demonstrations, and now we're hearing rumblings about economic disruption May 2028 and the midterms next year. But what do we actually do next? I mean, not just to get through these next few years, but to actually build something more democratic, more meaningful to working people, and more resilient than the neoliberal order that crumbled to make way for a MAGA incursion. And how can we, as Mamdani said in his victory speech on Tuesday night, quote, respond to oligarchy and authoritarianism with the strength it fears, not the appeasement it craves, end quote. Speaking to all that, we have our special guest, Eric Blanc, on with us today on the Labor Notes Pod. Eric is an assistant professor of labor studies at Rutgers University and an organizer-trainer in the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, where I'm also a volunteer.
And he wrote a piece that is now in our Roundtable series titled, After No Kings, How Can We Escalate? Thank you so much for joining us today, Eric.
Thanks for having me on.
In your piece, you raised this really resonant question. Are we cooked? So, are we?
I don't think so. The momentum we have, particularly after last night, is stronger than certainly Trump feared. And I think that the fate of American democracy really depends on what we do. So it's scary that the good news is that maybe we have a 50-50 chance of saving American democracy. And in addition to all of the things you said, as far as the attacks, I would just flag that on the most basic grounds, Trump is posing the question of whether you can actually elect out the Republicans from office. He's very openly pushing towards a scenario in which just we actually wouldn't be able to elect out a new administration. So if that's the case, we've fallen to a level of illiberal democracy, authoritarianism, that just really would pose a quantitative and qualitative new leap towards a different type of regime in this country. So I don't think that's inevitable, but it's certainly what Trump is pushing towards, and I think he's pushed there much further and faster than we thought was possible. And it's going to really, I think, come down to whether labor and social movements and the left can build enough mass disruption to shift popular opinion and to force the costs on the ruling class for this authoritarian push, to make those costs so high that we're able to overcome any attempts to steal elections in the coming period.
Yeah, thanks for that. Something we hear a lot is how institutions like unions and us as workers, neighbors, and democratic agents need to be ready to experiment with new tactics to meet this moment. We've been hearing, for instance, in the past month about how Chicago's residents are pushing back against ICE raids there and mobilizing quickly to protect their neighbors and to demonstrate. They've plugged into all these Facebook groups and chats that have sprung up this summer where people inform each other about ICE actions and respond to them, as Reuters reported this week. What other models of this type of organizing do you think are most interesting and important right now, and what do we need to be seeing more of?
I think the organizing in Chicago has been very inspirational, and there's really a lot of amazing stuff happening across the country. That being said, I think it's pretty important to have a sober assessment of the state of our movement. And if we're being honest, it's much weaker than it needs to be. The reality is that we're very siloed. So there's a lot of small groups doing different things. And insofar as we've been able to cohere for kind of big shows of force, the only thing we've really been able to do around that, and it's not nothing, are these No Kings rallies. And those really have been very successful in getting numbers into the streets, talking about up to 7 million people into the streets. That's not nothing. It's significant. But the problem is there's only so far that can go as in generating pressure. And so I think we need something at the scale of No Kings, but with a more of a nonviolent disruptive dynamic, which can, I think, on the one hand, grab people's attention and show that, oh, actually, what's going on is not normal. Trump is trying to normalize all of these attacks, and he's trying to make people scared. And so there needs to be some sense that fighting back is both necessary and possible. And so I think that the sweet spot is to try to think, what are the types of nonviolent mass disruption that can move us towards something like we saw an Occupy movement in 2011, the immigrant rights movement of 2006, Black Lives Matter in 2020, but against authoritarianism. And I don't think anybody has figured out exactly what that is yet, but I also think that not enough people on the left and in labor and social movements are posing that question. And that's essentially what I try to do in the article, is pose two ideas, and maybe other folks will find better ideas, but essentially what are scalable tactics that can unify our movements and not just have us sort of operating in silos.
Yeah, and I think that sober assessment probably resonates with what a lot of people have been feeling who are trying to figure out where they can put their actions in a way that's actually going to make a difference. And as you just mentioned, you sort of talk about in this piece these goals of building towards a form of economic disruption and of shifting popular opinion. And I'm curious, what are some of the challenges you see in getting there? And also, what are the lessons you think we can learn from things like Occupy Wall Street and the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as new organizing and strikes we've been seeing in recent years?
I think one of the crucial dynamics that we see when we've had real explosions of activity is that you need tactics and organizational forms that can go viral. So that's something we've seen in the labor movement where, Starbucks, after they had won an election in 2021, went viral because people were able to do the same thing. And part of the difficulty we have in the union movement, and I think it's pretty analogous in a lot of the staff-heavy nonprofits that kind of dominate the progressive space, is there isn't an ability or orientation towards this kind of bottom-up virality, because it's kind of a staff-driven dynamic in which you make your decisions, and you can't just sort of help let the movement go and try to build an upsurge. So the question is, how do you help spark an upsurge? And then how do you help that upsurge feed into ongoing organization? Because one of the limitations we've seen in Black Lives Matter, the immigrant rights movements, Occupy, is you have these massive protests, and then the organization afterwards is lacking. So the sweet spot really is something more like we saw with the Starbucks campaign or some of these other labor organizing dynamics where things go viral, but it's towards organizing. It's not just towards one-off mobilizations. And so the two of the ideas that I flag in the article that might do this. One would be what I call Freedom Fridays, in which high school students, together with their teachers, walk out in response to Trump sending in ICE. And we've already saw some walkouts in Chicago. And I know there's a lot of discussion in New York about what happens if Trump surges the troops or sends in ICE. And I think that something like that, where you have a snowball effect, where students walk out, teachers walk out, and then other labor unions and then other community groups to say, well, if they're walking out to disrupt these, armed goons from kidnapping our neighbors, why can't we? And that tends to be the type of dynamic we're looking for. You want to create examples that led other people to say, well, if they did it, we can do it too. And then the other suggestion I have is that rather than just talk about a general strike in 2028, because that's fine as a long-term perspective, but it doesn't actually get you the type of organizing or momentum you need to move there. The real question is, what do you do now? I argue that what we should be focusing on is a big national campaign or campaigns pressuring what scholars call the pillars of support for authoritarianism. So the literature on defeating authoritarianism really stresses that the crucial thing is, how do you peel away the main institutions in society away from the authoritarian regime? So we're talking about the companies, we're talking about the media, we're talking about the local bureaucracies, local governments. How do you get all these powerful institutions that right now are too scared of Trump to say anything to actually move away or explicitly break? And so the idea I suggest is, well, we should be essentially having mass campaigns to be pressuring and calling on these institutions, particularly companies, but not just, to take a stand for democracy, both through verbal expressions, but then also to break their current ties to the regime, all of the money that corporations are giving for free to Trump, or their business ties. And we should focus really heavily on organizing workers and community members and consumers, because consumers do have an important role to play in this, in pressuring these pillars of support to break from the regime. And I think if we do that, it'll give people a sense that organizing can make a difference. Part of the difficulty we have with these No Kings protests is you go there and you're like, well, it's not clear what this does. We don't think Trump is just going to listen to us. And so we need to articulate a campaign that to ordinary people, they can see how their specific participation can help move the needle. In a way that we saw with 100,000 people in New York, 100,000 people volunteered for Zoran because they knew if they went and canvassed, that could help elect Democratic Socialists to power. We need something of that level of sort of easy entryway for millions of people if we're going to defeat authoritarianism.
Yeah, on the note of moving the needle, so you mentioned Freedom Fridays. Could you say a little bit more about why high school students and teachers in particular are well positioned for actions like this?
The reality is, we do not have a strike wave in this country. We do not have a sort of mass bottom-up insurgency of workers striking against authoritarianism, against the bosses. Strike activity is very low. And so you have to think really strategically about what are the sectors of society that both have a potential disposition to walking out, so maybe lean more towards activism or to left-wing ideas, but then also who have maybe fewer retaliation threats against them, and then also who, if they take action, is likely to help sort of spark something broader because they're linked to the community. And so the sweet spot for this really are high school students and teachers. If they walk out, it's pretty unlikely that they'll get fired or expelled. So it's different than if you're working at Amazon, and where if you walk out, you could face that kind of retaliation very immediately. So it's easier to get the ball rolling because people are a little bit less scared. And then also teachers and high school students are just organically connected to the rest of the working class. And so because of that, there is historically always been kind of a role for a vanguard of students in particular, sometimes university students, but oftentimes high school students, in which they are able to be the sort of first spark because, for a variety of reasons, having more free time, more of a disposition to taking risks, they can kind of do it when everyone else is too scared. And I think that is the thing we should be orienting towards, not at the exclusion of anything else, but we already saw it in Chicago. There have been high school student walkouts in New York. Now, various high school groups are already openly saying we're going to walk out if Trump surges ICE. And so I do think that is a kind of lever in which you could start a snowball effect with the broader working class to fight back.
So going back to this question of protests, the right wing portrays protests as sites of disorder and chaos, and misdirects from the fact that it is often armed law enforcement escalating tensions and instigating these violent scenes that the Trump administration then uses to justify bringing in troops. And it feels like a deliberate distraction from what this type of civic response is actually like, who joins these demonstrations and why, how strategically they're organized, the institutions involved, and the possibilities of bringing in more institutional participation. as you write in your piece. How can we think and talk differently about the role of protests? And is it possible to build towards the kind of general strikes we've seen recently in other parts of the world, including in India, Italy, and in Greece?
The goal of a general strike is a good goal. I'm worried that the way we talk about it is a little unstrategic because it underestimates the extent to which the labor movement is so weak in this country that we are just not at the point currently where we're anywhere near where unions would be open or willing to strike, and even in 2028. And so the crucial thing is really that we need to find ways to build up momentum at work and beyond. And I think given how lackluster unions' response has been, frankly, against Trump, it might be that the energy at first really comes from outside and then seeps into the workplace more. And so I think it's really incumbent on us to maybe pivot a little bit away from just talking about general strikes as a goal and to talk more about what do we do in the short term and midterm to really start scaling up wide-scale resistance. And the way general strikes have actually normally happened in the US is not that people call general strikes and then it happens. It's normally some group of workers is on strike and then there's some sort of confrontation oftentimes with the police, something terrible happens or there's something, and then it snowballs into a general strike because the rest of the working class was following this one strike and trying to lend solidarity to it. That's probably the only way it would actually happen in the US too. The only other example was 1886 with the 8-hour day, but that was that was at the tail end of like 5 years of upsurge and in which there was just workers walking out, and we're just not in that moment today. So it's a good goal. Obviously, it would be great to have a general strike, but our labor movement right now is barely even able to mobilize its members for No Kings rallies. At most, maybe send out an email, but just the organizing muscle is so weak that I think it's necessary to be really sober about that and to try to get momentum from wherever we can.
I thought you just post we should have a general strike on Reddit and then a general strike happens. But maybe I'm wrong. As we've been talking about, there is a lot of appetite now, especially among people who've joined a protest, to do something more meaningful and effective besides registering our dissent, which we know the billionaire class is well aware of and doesn't particularly care about because, well, they don't have to. But as we've talked about, we're not quite set up for a general strike. So what are some intermediate steps we can take to create meaningful disruption short of striking?
Yeah, so maybe I can just build off of a little what I mentioned before. So the two major ideas I floated in the piece, and again, actually, I'm not so wedded to these two specific ideas, but I'm trying to help folks think, pose the question, what would be that kind of level of nonviolent disruption that would actually move the needle? And part of it has to be, I think, leveraging economic costs. We do have a lot of leverage over companies, both because those companies depend on our labor and they also depend generally on us buying their products. And pivoting not just to protesting what the companies are doing, because there have been protests, saying it's bad that Amazon is doing, is collaborating with ICE. It's good to highlight that, but that's actually not a campaign. Just saying something is bad isn't really a campaign. There's not like an escalating step through which you can get large numbers of people involved and they could see how their participation would make a difference. So I think what we actually need are campaigns oriented towards companies and also, school administrations, local governments, churches, all of these intermediary pillars. And it can take something as simple as, at first, a letter, so the workers, workers for Amazon. And this is sort of happening in some places, corporate workers, tech workers at Amazon saying, why is Amazon, helping an authoritarian government terrorize undocumented people? That's not the values that I was told this company stood for. It's not what we stand for, and we think it shouldn't happen. So there's ways in which parts of the workforce in these different companies can leverage their sort of participation. Then also, I do think we have a lot of leverage as consumers and more than we've been used to talking about. I think sometimes on the left and labor left, we poo-poo the consumer piece because we're about worker disruption. And I think that there's good reasons for that. Obviously, striking is, all other things being equal, more effective than boycotting. But again, partly because we have so few strikes these days. And also we have seen important impacts of boycotts. Part of the reason Starbucks is at the bargaining table, for instance, is that there was a mass boycott of Starbucks in relation to Israel and Palestine. And actually, the boycott used to be a very militant tactic. And it's only recently, in the last 40, 50 years, has the labor movement sort of only used boycotts as what you do after you lose the battle. That's how it happens today. You lose the battle and they say, oh, we're not going to shop there anymore. But it's not a campaign. I do think there's a world in which you can be oriented towards, let's say next May Day, May 1st, 2026, we do, how many months are we from there? 6, 8 months. You spend these next 6, 8 months pushing the leaderships of these different institutions, companies, XYZ, to take a stand against authoritarianism and to break their ties insofar as they have them. And then if they don't, and you choose maybe the 5 or 10 worst perpetrators who are, refusing to bend, and on that day, on May 1st, nobody shops at those companies. We call on workers to sick out, and that's different. A sick out is not a strike, but you're also less likely to get fired, so more people are likely to do it. And then you have mass protests and nonviolent civil disobedience to say, look, these companies are siding with authoritarians, and the authoritarian regime won't be able to survive if these companies, these institutions, and these school administrations, if they side with the people instead of the autocrats, the regime can't survive. And I think that you pose that question and leverage real costs on them, starting with one day. And then, and if it happens, then you can do it again. You can escalate. And that, I think the idea of a campaign rather than just a one-off protest is really kind of the direction we need to move as far as economic disruption.
I'm so glad you brought up the boycott so boldly on the podcast, because I'm always walking around Labor Notes kind of whispering like, are we not talking about boycotts enough? So I really appreciate that. I just wanted to ask, what would be sort of your closing message to anyone who still feels like Trump's authoritarian power grab may be an insurmountable force in a time when labor feels like it's on the back foot, even though there's been some recent upsurge in popularity?
Well, I would say that, just look at last night in New York, we elected a Democratic Socialist to the most important, most financially central city in the country, in the world. And so that happened because there was a movement. And I think that the kind of movement that erupted around Zoran shows how much potential there is everywhere. There's nothing specific in the water in New York that made this possible. It couldn't happen elsewhere. And so the question is, how do you build a campaign and a fight, not just electorally, but in the streets and workplaces, that can provide a path to victory, that people can see how their involvement will actually change things. And I think that if you do that, especially after yesterday, in which we've just seen there's a nationwide repudiation of the Trump regime, it's just uncontestable that people do not like what's going on. If and when then you can provide an alternative for movements to scale up, not just in New York, but elsewhere, then I do really think that there's a very strong chance that we can shift popular opinion enough, continue to move it away from Trump, and most of all, at this point, frankly, create enough threat of disruption and disruption itself that when Trump does what seems like is almost inevitable at this point, which is to, claim there's massive electoral fraud or blah, 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 and use whatever means he can to, stay in power in 2026 and 2028, that we have the muscles already sort of moving so that we know how to disrupt things enough that essentially we can force the rest of the ruling class to not go along with an authoritarian coup. And that's scary, but I do think that it's realistic. I think that's actually what we're talking about. And the good news is we know that the American public is with us. We have a very strong sense now that what Trump is doing is not popular, that he has no mandate for that. And I feel like after yesterday and with the momentum we have, we can double down our efforts to organize and defeat him.
Thanks, Eric. Well, that's our episode. Please rate us or leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. If you're listening to us on Podbean at labornotespodcast.podbean.com, download our episode.
We're in November, which means we're in our annual end-of-year fundraising season. If you like the podcast, if you like our magazine, if you find our coverage and our workshops useful for your organizing and in steadying your resolve in this turbulent era, support us. One of the best ways is by becoming a monthly donor, which gives us the kind of consistent support that allows us to report from shop floors, union halls, and picket lines, and to put on programming that is bringing together a growing number of rank-and-file union members who are really looking to mobilize right now and seeking out our resources and networks. You can become a monthly donor at labornotes.org/donate. If you start a new monthly donation at $10 a month or more, you'll get our limited edition Fight the Boss, Build the Union t-shirt, along with a free subscription to the Labor Notes magazine. And we will share regular updates on Labor Notes projects and organizing efforts, and you can be in closer touch with our staff.
Speaking of our programming, we also have a bunch of events coming up that you can sign up for at labornotes.org/events. And if you sign up for one, you can also get a code for a 50% discount to the Labor Notes magazine and get 11 issues for just $15 a year instead of 30. Our next Secrets of a Successful Organizer series kicks off tomorrow on November 8th and continues for part 2 on November 22nd. So that's 2 Saturdays, November 8th and 22nd, noon to 3 p.m. Eastern. And our next What to Do When Your Union Breaks Your Heart workshop will be on Tuesday, November 11th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern.
Our Stewards Workshop this month is on the topic of dealing with difficult supervisors and will be on Thursday, November 20th at 8 p.m. Eastern. We'll also be running our Winning a Strong Contract series on Mondays, December 1st and December 8th at 7 p.m. Eastern. Be sure to attend our Secrets Workshop first, though. And again, don't forget to join our Labor Notes Roundtable webinar on Tuesday, November 18th, where you can hear from other contributors to the series. Sign up on labornotes.org/events. And we've also got an in-person event coming up next month. That would be the Troublemaker School in New Orleans on Saturday, December 6th. You can sign up for that on labornotes.org/events as well.
The Labor Notes podcast is produced by Daniel Smith, Sindhu Sundar, and myself. Our title music was written and performed by our coworker, Keith Brower Brown. See you next week. Solidarity, y'all.